Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading somewhere you probably didn't expect. Luxembourg. Yes, the tiny country squeezed between France, Belgium and Germany that most people forget exists until they're doing a European geography quiz at 2 in the morning. But here's the thing about Luxembourg, it's punched so far above its weight class throughout history that it makes heavyweight boxers look lazy. This is a country smaller than Rhode Island that somehow became wealthier per capita than almost anywhere on Earth, survived more invasions than a medieval castle's guest book, and went from literal medieval castle to global financial powerhouse. Oh, and it started because a guy traded some land for a rock in the year 963. We'll get to that. From the Bock promontory to blast furnaces, from being called the Gibraltar of the North to becoming Europe's banking capital, this is the story of survival through adaptation. Drop a comment with where you're listening from, and if you've enjoyed this series so far, hit subscribe. Trust me, you don't want to miss where we're going next. Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's explore how a castle on a rock became one of the most fascinating countries in Europe. Chapter 1. Introduction and Geographic Overview. Let's begin with the basics, because understanding Luxembourg's geography is essential to understanding why this place exists at all. Luxembourg sits nestled in Western Europe like a small, extremely wealthy throw pillow, wedged between three significantly larger couches. To the west and north you'll find Belgium. To the east, Germany stretches along the border formed largely by the scenic rivers Moselle, Sauer and Our. And to the south lies France, probably wondering why Luxembourg gets to be independent while Alsace-Lorraine spent centuries being tossed back and forth like a geographical hot potato. The entire country covers just 2,586 square kilometres, making it the 7th smallest nation in Europe. To put that in perspective, it's smaller than the state of Rhode Island, tinier than Long Island, and roughly equivalent to the area of Dorset in England. You could drive from the northernmost point to the southern border in about 2 hours, assuming traffic cooperates and you don't stop at any of the approximately 700 castles along the way. I'm exaggerating about the castle count, but only slightly. This place takes its medieval heritage seriously. Geographically, Luxembourg divides itself into two distinct regions, each with its own personality and presumably its own opinions about the other. The northern region, known as the Ösling or Ösling, depending on whether you're speaking Luxembourgish or German, occupies roughly 1/3 of the country's total area. This is Luxembourg's slice of the Ardennes Plateau, a landscape of rolling hills, dense forests, and rocky outcrops that look like they were specifically designed for dramatic medieval sieges and contemporary hiking Instagram posts. The terrain here is rugged by Luxembourg standards, which means it features hills that might charitably be called mountains if you squint and have never seen the Alps. The highest point in the entire country sits in this northern region at Nief, which reaches the dizzying elevation of 560 metres above sea level. For our American friends, that's about 1,837 feet, or roughly the height of a particularly ambitious skyscraper. The Ardennes region is sparsely populated, covered in beech and oak forests, and home to more deer than people in some areas. It's the kind of place where you can actually achieve the solitude and tranquility that Luxembourg's tourism board promises, assuming you can mentally block out the fact that you're never more than 20 kilometres from an international border. South of the Ardennes lies the Gutland, or Good Land, which tells you everything you need to know about how the medieval Luxembourgers felt about marketing. Why come up with a creative name when you can just call the nice part of your country the Good Land and call it a day? The Gutland comprises the remaining 2/3 of Luxembourg and features a gentler landscape of rolling countryside, fertile valleys, and significantly less dramatic elevation changes. This is where the majority of Luxembourg's population lives, works, and presumably enjoys the fact that they don't have to hike uphill both ways to buy groceries. The Gutland itself subdivides into several distinct areas, each contributing to Luxembourg's surprising geographic diversity. The Moselle Valley runs along the eastern border with Germany, following the course of the Moselle River as it meanders southward. This region is Luxembourg's wine country, producing crisp white wines that have been described as surprisingly good for a country most people forget makes wine. The valley features picturesque villages with names like Remich, Grevenmacher and Schengen, the latter being famous for lending its name to the Schengen Agreement that eliminated border controls across much of Europe. Imagine being such a small town that your main claim to fame is being where people decided to stop checking passports. The central Gutland, sometimes called the Bon Pays or Good Country, because apparently calling it the Good Land wasn't quite good enough, consists of agricultural land, forests, and the sprawling suburbs of Luxembourg City. This is prosperous farming country, though modern Luxembourg makes so much money from banking and finance that agriculture now represents less than 1% of the GDP. The farmers are still there, mind you, they're just probably diversifying into cryptocurrency on the side. And then there's Luxembourg City itself, the capital and by far the largest urban area in the country, home to roughly 135,000 people in the city proper, and about 200,000 in the greater metropolitan area. The city sits on a dramatic rocky promontory, carved by the Alzette and Petrus rivers into a landscape of gorges, cliffs and valleys that made it one of the most formidable fortress cities in European history. The old town perches on top of the plateau, while lower districts spread through the valleys below, connected by a series of bridges that range from medieval stone structures to modern engineering marvels. The city's defensive position was so impressive that it earned the nickname Gibraltar of the North, which is high praise from people who had actually seen Gibraltar. The fortress of Luxembourg, which we'll discuss in much greater detail later, was built and rebuilt over the centuries into a complex of fortifications so extensive that it contained 23 kilometres of underground tunnels carved directly into the rock. These casemates, as they're called, could house thousands of soldiers along with their horses, equipment, and presumably their growing sense of claustrophobia. Today, portions of the casemates are open to tourists, offering a fascinating glimpse into what it was like to defend a city when defence meant hiding in damp tunnels and hoping the enemy got bored before you did. Luxembourg's rivers deserve special mention because they've shaped both the geography and history of this small nation. The Moselle forms much of the eastern border, serving as a natural boundary with Germany and providing excellent conditions for viticulture. The Schur, also spelled sour depending on which linguistic tradition you prefer, flows from Belgium through northern Luxembourg before joining the Moselle. The Our River, meanwhile, forms part of the northeastern border with Germany, cutting through deep valleys in the Ardennes, and the Alzette, though entirely within Luxembourg's borders, carves the dramatic gorges that made Luxembourg City such an attractive defensive position. These rivers have served multiple purposes throughout history. They provided water for agriculture and industry, powered mills and forges, formed natural defensive barriers, and established clear borders when European powers were dividing up the continent like a particularly contentious game of Risk. In modern times, they're primarily valued for their scenic beauty and recreational opportunities, though the Moselle continues to support commercial shipping, proving that even small rivers can have big ambitions. The climate of Luxembourg is temperate oceanic, which as meteorologists speak for expect rain, but probably not too much, and snow, but probably not too much of that either. Winters are mild by continental European standards, with average temperatures hovering just above freezing. Snow falls regularly in the Ardennes, but less frequently in the lower-lying Jutland. Summers are moderate and pleasant, rarely reaching the scorching temperatures that plague southern Europe, making Luxembourg an ideal destination for people who enjoy outdoor activities but dislike sweating. Rainfall distributes fairly evenly throughout the year, with the western regions receiving slightly more precipitation due to their exposure to Atlantic weather systems. The Moselle Valley, sheltered by the surrounding hills, enjoys a somewhat drier and sunnier microclimate, which the grapevines appreciate even if the farmers take it for granted. Overall, Luxembourg's weather can best be described as aggressively moderate, the meteorological equivalent of a polite shrug. From a natural resources perspective, Luxembourg historically punched above its weight, though you wouldn't necessarily guess it from looking at a modern map. The southern region, particularly around Esch-sur-Alzette and the French border, sits atop substantial iron ore deposits that fueled Luxembourg's transformation into an industrial powerhouse in the 19th and 20th centuries. These deposits, part of the larger Lorraine ore field, enabled Luxembourg to develop a massive steel industry that made the country wealthy long before it discovered the joys of international banking. The forests of the Ardennes provided timber for construction and fuel, while the rivers supplied water power for early industries. Limestone deposits scattered throughout the country supplied building material for Luxembourg's numerous castles, churches, and fortifications, ensuring that even the architecture would be locally sourced. Modern Luxembourg has largely moved beyond resource extraction, but the legacy of the iron ore remains visible in the industrial south, where former steel towns have reinvented themselves as cultural centres with varying degrees of success. Luxembourg's position in the heart of Western Europe has been simultaneously its greatest advantage and its most persistent curse. Situated at the crossroads of Germanic and Romance cultures, nestled between historically powerful neighbours, the territory has served as a buffer zone, a battlefield, a strategic fortress, and a convenient thing to trade when larger powers needed to balance their treaties. The same geographic position that made Luxembourg vulnerable to invasion also made it valuable enough to survive as an independent entity, though independence came with the asterisk of being occupied, controlled, or influenced by practically every major European power at one time or another. This small piece of land has witnessed Roman legions, Frankish kings, Spanish tercios, French revolutionary armies, Prussian troops, and German invaders marching across its borders. It has been a county, a duchy, a Grand Duchy, a province of the Spanish Netherlands, an Austrian possession, a French department, a member of the German Confederation, and finally, an independent nation and founding member of the European Union. Not bad for a country smaller than Rhode Island. Today, Luxembourg's geography serves it well in ways the medieval castle builders never imagined. Its central location makes it an ideal headquarters for European institutions and international corporations. Its small size means you can live in one corner of the country and work in another without a soul-crushing commute. And its borders with 3 major European nations create a cosmopolitan atmosphere where multiple languages blend seamlessly, which is helpful when your country has 3 official languages and most of your population speaks at least 4. So as you settle in for this journey through Luxembourg's history and geography, remember that we're exploring a place that's small in size but enormous in significance. A country that started as a castle on a rock and evolved into one of the wealthiest and most stable nations on earth. A land where you can hike in the Ardennes in the morning, tour wine caves in the afternoon, and still be home for dinner because the entire country is only 82 kilometres long. From this geographic foundation, we'll trace Luxembourg's story from its earliest inhabitants through Roman occupation, medieval glory, centuries of foreign rule, and eventual independence. We'll explore how this tiny territory survived when larger and more powerful neighbours didn't, and how it transformed itself from a strategic fortress into a modern economic powerhouse. But for now, close your eyes and picture those rolling hills, deep forests, dramatic gorges, and improbable castles. This is Luxembourg, and its story is just beginning. Chapter 2: Ancient and Medieval Foundations. Long before anyone thought to build a castle on a rock and call it Luxembourg, this territory was already home to people who understood the strategic value of living between rivers in the heart of Europe. The earliest inhabitants we know much about were the Celts, specifically a tribe called the Treveri, who showed up around 150 BCE, possibly earlier, and decided that the Moselle Valley looked like an excellent place to settle down and make everybody else nervous. The Treveri were part of the larger Belgae group, which Julius Caesar would later describe in terms that make them sound like the sort of neighbours you'd really prefer lived on someone else's street. They occupied the lower valley of the Moselle River, spreading across what is now Luxembourg, southeastern Belgium, and western Germany. Their territory sat on the southern fringes of the Ardennes forest, a massive woodland that medieval Europeans called the Silva Arduena, which sounds much more impressive than simply those woods to the north where the bears live. What made the Treveri particularly interesting, aside from their excellent cavalry and their tendency to get into fights with Romans, was their identity crisis. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, the Treveri claimed to be of Germanic descent, allegedly to distance themselves from what they considered Gallic laziness. This is the ancient equivalent of insisting you're from the cooler part of town when you're actually from the suburbs. In reality, they spoke a Celtic language, and their culture blended Gallic and Germanic influences, making them the sort of people who confused Roman census takers and modern archaeologists alike. The Treveri weren't just wandering around the forests looking menacing. They built oppida, which is Latin for fortified settlements, and also makes them sound more organised than they probably were. The largest and most important of these was Titelberg, located in the extreme southwest of modern Luxembourg. By the 1st century BCE, Titelberg had developed into a proper urban centre, spanning about 50 hectares, with ramparts, residential areas, metalworking facilities, and a mint for producing coins. This was almost certainly the capital of the Treveri, the place where their chieftains lived and made important decisions like, should we fight the Romans today or wait until tomorrow? Titelberg's prosperity came from iron ore deposits in the nearby hills. The Treveri mined this ore, smelted it into iron, and traded it along routes connecting the Rhone Valley to the Moselle and points beyond. Archaeological excavations have uncovered foundations of various buildings, a Gallo-Roman temple, evidence of extensive metalworking, and enough Celtic coins from different tribes to suggest that Titelberg was a major trading hub. The place had defensive ramparts about 3 metres high, constructed with stone and earth in classic Celtic hill fort style, which must have seemed quite impressive until someone invented artillery. The Treveri's relationship with Rome was what historians politely call complicated. Initially, they provided Julius Caesar with some of his best cavalry during the Gallic Wars, which started in 58 BCE. Their leader Cingetorix was pro-Roman and happy to cooperate. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Cingetorix had a rival named Indutiomarus who held different opinions about Roman occupation, specifically that it should end immediately and violently. In 54 BCE, Indutiomarus managed to exile Cingetorix and take control of the Treveri. He He then did what any self-respecting Celtic chieftain would do under the circumstances. He allied with other rebellious tribes and led attacks on Roman winter camps. The Roman general Titus Labienus, who was second in command to Caesar and not the sort of person you wanted as an enemy, responded by killing Indutiomarus during a sortie and then conducting punitive raids throughout Treveri territory. The lesson here is that attacking Roman camps is a bold strategy that rarely ends well for the attackers. Despite these setbacks, the Treveri remained more successful than most Gallic tribes in cooperating with the Romans once the conquest was complete in 53 BCE. They adapted readily to Roman civilization, which is to say they kept their lands, paid their taxes, and tried not to start any more doomed rebellions. The region became part of Gallia Belgica, one of the provinces of Roman Gaul, and the Romans founded Augusta Treverorum near modern Trier, which became the capital and gave the tribe its lasting fame. Roman occupation brought roads, aqueducts, villas, and all the infrastructure that made the empire function. 3 major Roman roads crossed through Luxembourg's territory, connecting major cities like Reims, Trier, and Cologne. Archaeological sites scattered throughout modern Luxembourg reveal the extent of Roman settlement. Villa complexes, burial monuments, milestones marking distances, and even an underground water system called the Rashpetzer Kanat, built around 150 CE. The Romans knew how to build things that lasted, which is why we're still finding their stuff buried in people's backyards. The peaceful Romano-Gallic period lasted for several centuries, during which the territory prospered from trade, agriculture, and the benefits of being part of the largest empire in the known world. Then the empire started falling apart, which it did slowly and with considerable drama involving Germanic tribes moving west and Roman legions being recalled to defend more important places. By the early 5th century CE, the Franks had infiltrated the region, and Rome abandoned the territory in 406 CE, presumably with a note saying, "Good luck with everything." The Franks, who would eventually give their name to France and also to a lot of medieval dynasties nobody can keep straight, absorbed the Treveri and turned the region into part of the Merovingian kingdom of Austrasia. When Charlemagne unified much of Western Europe into the Carolingian Empire in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, Luxembourg's territory became part of this grand project. The Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided Charlemagne's empire among his grandsons in a way guaranteed to cause future conflicts, placed the region in Middle Francia. This kingdom was ruled by Lothair, which is why it was called Lotharingia, and it sat uncomfortably between East Francia and West Francia, like a buffer state that everybody wanted to claim. Middle Francia had the lifespan you'd expect from a kingdom sandwiched between larger and more aggressive neighbours. By 855, it fragmented further, and Luxembourg's territory ended up in Lotharingia. When that divided in 959, the region fell to the Duchy of Upper Lorraine within the Holy Roman Empire. At this point, keeping track of which kingdom controlled what requires a flowchart and considerable patience. The true history of Luxembourg as a distinct political entity begins in 963, which is a delightfully specific date that makes historians happy. This is when Count Siegfried, a nobleman from the House of Ardennes, made what would turn out to be one of the more consequential real estate transactions in European history. Siegfried was the youngest son of Count Palatine Wigeric of Lotharingia, which meant he inherited comparatively little from his father. His older brothers got duchies and counties. Siegfried got some scattered possessions in Upper Lorraine, and the thankless job of being advocate for the abbeys of St. Maximin in Trier and St. Willibrord in Echternach, which basically meant he was supposed to protect church property and probably mediate disputes between monks. Not exactly a glamorous position for an ambitious nobleman. On the 7th of April in 963, Siegfried traded some of his ancestral lands to the Abbey of St. Maximin in exchange for a rocky promontory with the ruins of an old fortification called Luxembourg, which translates to Little Fortress or possibly Small Castle. The exact etymology is debated, but modern historians link it to Letze, meaning fortification. The site may have held the remains of a Roman watchtower, or perhaps just an early medieval refuge, but either way, it was basically a rock with some old walls on it. What Siegfried saw that the monks apparently didn't was the strategic potential of this location. The Bock promontory sat about 70 metres above the Alzette River, surrounded on three sides by deep valleys carved by the Alzette and Petrus rivers. The cliffs provided natural defence that would make any military engineer weep with joy. Even better, the site sat near the intersection of the old Roman road from Reims to Trier and a prehistoric path connecting Metz to Liège. This meant trade routes, which meant money, which meant power. Siegfried built a stronghold on the rock, starting what would become one of the most fortified sites in European history. A marketplace developed at the intersection of the trade routes below the castle, and a settlement began to grow around it. This is the official founding of Luxembourg City, and through marriage, acquisition, and the occasional military conflict, Siegfried established what would become the County of Luxembourg. The formal title, Count of Luxembourg, wouldn't appear in written records until about 120 years later under Conrad I, but Siegfried is considered the founder of both the city and the county. Siegfried was also busy with other projects that didn't involve real estate speculation. In 964, he laid the foundations for Saarburg Castle. He was a loyal servant to the Holy Roman Emperors, which was a smart career move when you were trying to hold on to a small territory surrounded by people who might want to take it. From 966 to 972, he accompanied Emperor Otto I to Rome. In 982, he sent troops to support Otto II against the Saracens in southern Italy. He served as a mediator between the emperor and Hugh Capet, who would eventually become King of France, which required considerable diplomatic skill and probably a high tolerance for bureaucratic tedium. In 985, Siegfried was briefly captured and imprisoned by King Lothair of France during conflicts between the French kingdom and the Holy Roman Empire, which must have been an awkward experience but apparently didn't dampen his enthusiasm for imperial service. When Siegfried died on the 28th of October in 998, his son Henry I inherited the county and continued building the family's power base. Through his mother Kunigunde, who was a granddaughter of King Louis the Stammerer of West Francia, Siegfried was a sixth-generation descendant of Charlemagne. This gave the House of Luxembourg impeccable lineage and complicated family trees that would make genealogists very excited. Siegfried's brothers also founded their own branches of the House of Ardennes, becoming dukes and counts and bishops across Lotharingia. This extensive family network helped the Counts of Luxembourg increase their influence and territory through strategic marriages and alliances. The County of Luxembourg grew steadily over the following centuries, through the time-honoured medieval methods of marriage alliances, land purchases, vassalage agreements, and wars. By the late 13th century, Luxembourg occupied a vast territory between the Meuse and Moselle rivers, straddling the linguistic border between German-speaking and French-speaking populations. The county was envied for its powerful and strategic geographic position, which is medieval speak for everybody wanted to conquer it or marry into it. The fortress on the Bock continued to expand throughout the medieval period. By the mid-12th century, substantial stone ramparts surrounded the growing town, with defensive walls that followed roughly the line of modern Rue de Fossé. These fortifications featured round towers suitable for medieval combat, where defenders could drop things on attackers and presumably feel very satisfied about it. In the 14th century, demographic growth and the need for more space prompted the construction of new ramparts further west, approximately where Boulevard Royal runs today. The urban area expanded from 5 hectares to 23 hectares, which sounds modest but represented significant growth for a medieval city. During the 14th century and the first half of the 15th century, the House of Luxembourg reached the peak of its power and influence. The dynasty produced 4 Holy Roman emperors: Henry VII, Charles IV, Wenceslaus, and Sigismund. They also provided 4 kings of Bohemia, which made Luxembourg one of the most influential dynasties in European politics. This was quite an achievement for a family that started with a younger son trading some land for a castle on a rock. In 1354, Emperor Charles IV, who was also Count of Luxembourg and King of Bohemia, elevated Luxembourg from a county to a duchy for his brother Wenceslaus. This promotion reflected Luxembourg's importance and the dynasty's prestige. The Duchy of Luxembourg was now a major player in the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire, competing with powerful houses like the Habsburgs and the Wittelsbachs. But as any student of medieval history knows, dynasties rise and fall with alarming regularity, usually due to some combination of warfare, succession crises, and bad luck. The male line of the House of Luxembourg came to an end when Emperor Sigismund died in 1437 without male heirs. His niece Elizabeth inherited the duchy, which she later sold to Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, in 1444. This marked the end of Luxembourg's independence and the beginning of several centuries of foreign rule that would shape its destiny in ways Siegfried probably never imagined when he first traded for that castle on a rock. The medieval period established Luxembourg's fundamental characteristics: its strategic location, its formidable fortress, its position as a valuable prize in European politics, and its role as a crossroads between Germanic and Romance cultures. These foundations, built on Celtic oppida and Roman roads, strengthened with medieval walls and dynasty building, would carry Luxembourg through centuries of occupation, conflict, and eventual emergence as an independent nation. But that story belongs to the chapters ahead. Chapter 3: Spanish and Austrian Rule. When we left Luxembourg at the end of the medieval period, the male line of the House of Luxembourg had just expired like a subscription nobody remembered to renew, and the duchy had been sold to Philip the Good of Burgundy. This transaction in 1444 marked the end of Luxembourg's independence and the beginning of what would turn out to be over 4 centuries of being passed around European powers, like a particularly valuable trading card that everyone wanted but nobody could keep permanently. Philip the Good was one of those medieval rulers whose nickname actually matched his personality, at least in terms of administrative competence and patronage of the arts. He ruled as Duke of Burgundy from 1419 to 1467, and during that time he assembled an impressive collection of territories across the Low Countries through a combination of inheritance, purchase, conquest, and strategic marriages. By the time he acquired Luxembourg in 1444, he already controlled Flanders, Artois, Hainaut, Brabant, Holland, Zeeland, and Namur, which made him one of the most powerful rulers in Western Europe, despite technically being a vassal of the King of France. Luxembourg fit neatly into Philip's growing Burgundian Netherlands, a collection of territories that would become known for their wealth, culture, and tendency to get caught up in everyone else's wars. The fortress of Luxembourg was already formidable by this point, having been steadily improved throughout the medieval period, but the Burgundians recognized that it could be even more formidable. This would become a recurring theme over the next 4 centuries. Every new owner looking at Luxembourg's fortress and thinking, "This is impressive, but what if we made it bigger?" Philip the Good died in 1467, leaving his territories to his son Charles the Bold, who earned his nickname through a combination of military aggression and spectacularly bad decision-making. Charles had grand ambitions of turning the Burgundian Netherlands into an independent kingdom, which would have been impressive if he hadn't gotten himself killed at the Battle of Nancy in 1477. The male line of the Dukes of Burgundy died with him, leaving everything to his only child, Mary of Burgundy, who suddenly found herself one of the most eligible heiresses in Europe and also in desperate need of military protection. Mary married Archduke Maximilian of Austria, of the House of Habsburg, in 1477. This marriage was excellent news for Mary, who got a capable military commander to help defend her inheritance, and spectacular news for the Habsburgs, who suddenly acquired vast territories in the Low Countries without having to conquer them. From 1477 onward, Luxembourg would remain under Habsburg control, though which branch of the Habsburgs controlled it would change depending on who died and who inherited what in a family tree that requires advanced degrees in genealogy to fully comprehend. The 16th century brought major changes to Luxembourg's fortress, driven primarily by the fact that gunpowder artillery had fundamentally transformed siege warfare. Medieval walls with their round towers and vertical construction were excellent for dropping rocks on people, but considerably less impressive when faced with cannons. The fortress needed to adapt or become obsolete, and Luxembourg's various owners were not about to let their strategic asset become obsolete. In 1542, the fortress changed hands during conflicts between King Francis I of France and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Luxembourg was captured and recaptured multiple times between 1542 and 1544, which must have been exhausting for the residents who had to keep track of which flag was flying that week. When the dust settled in 1544, the fortress remained in Habsburg hands, and Charles V decided that enough was enough. These constant sieges proved that Luxembourg needed serious defensive upgrades. Around 1545, Charles V brought in Italian and Dutch engineers to modernize the fortifications. They constructed the first bastions linked by curtain walls, utilizing a design known as Tres Italien, or Star Fort architecture. These angular bastions replaced the old round towers, providing overlapping fields of fire that made it much harder for attackers to approach the walls without being shot at from multiple directions. The new fortifications were built roughly where Boulevard Roosevelt and Boulevard Royal run today, which means modern Luxembourg residents drive their cars through what used to be state-of-the-art military engineering. In 1556, Charles V abdicated, dividing his enormous Habsburg Empire between his brother Ferdinand, who got Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, and his son Philip II, who got Spain and everything else, including the Netherlands and Luxembourg. This meant Luxembourg became part of the Spanish Netherlands, a collection of territories in the Low Countries controlled by the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty. It would remain Spanish for over a century, during which time it would be fought over repeatedly because nothing says valuable strategic asset quite like multiple countries trying to conquer the same fortress. The Spanish period saw Luxembourg's fortifications reach new levels of impressiveness. In 1644, under the supervision of Swiss fortress builder Isaac von Trebach, Spanish engineers began constructing the casemates that would become one of Luxembourg's most distinctive features. These weren't just simple underground passages, they were extensive networks of tunnels carved directly into the rock beneath the fortress, designed to allow troops and supplies to move around without being exposed to enemy fire. The Spanish casemates used the cellars of the medieval castle as their starting point and expanded from there, creating passages, galleries and chambers that served multiple purposes. Soldiers could man artillery positions cut into the rock face, firing through embrasures while remaining protected. Supplies could be stored safely underground. Troops could move from one section of the fortress to another without crossing open ground. The casemates also provided shelter during bombardments, which was increasingly important as artillery became more powerful and more common. By the time the Spanish were finished with their initial construction, Luxembourg had become one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe. The fortress featured multiple rings of walls, bastions at strategic points, and those remarkable underground passages that made the whole complex far more resilient than surface fortifications alone could achieve. Visitors today can still tour portions of these Spanish-era casemates, walking through tunnels that once held soldiers, horses, gunpowder, and provisions for withstanding long sieges. In 1683, King Louis XIV of France decided that he wanted Luxembourg, which was not particularly surprising given that Louis wanted most things and had the military power to take them. He sent his forces to besiege the city, and after a month-long siege in 1684 they succeeded. The French king then did what any ambitious monarch would do. He brought in the best military engineer in Europe to make the fortress even better. That engineer was Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban, whose name became synonymous with fortress design in the 17th century. Vauban was to military engineering what Beethoven was to symphonies. He didn't just build fortresses, he revolutionized how people thought about fortification. He looked at Luxembourg's natural defences and existing fortifications and saw opportunities for improvement everywhere. Vauban expanded the casemates significantly, recognising that underground passages were just as important as surface installations. He redesigned defensive works, added new bastions, and generally turned Luxembourg into what many contemporaries considered the most formidable fortress in Europe after Gibraltar. The comparison to Gibraltar wasn't just flattery. Luxembourg's combination of natural defensive features and engineered fortifications created a position that could withstand almost any assault. Hence the nickname that would stick for the next 2 centuries, the Gibraltar of the North. The French occupation lasted until 1698, when the Treaty of Ryswick returned Luxembourg to Spanish control. Then in 1701, France took it back. Then in 1713, after the War of the Spanish Succession, the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt handed Luxembourg to the Dutch for 2 years. Finally, in 1715, Austrian Habsburg troops took possession, and Luxembourg became part of the Austrian Netherlands. If you're getting dizzy trying to keep track of who controlled what when, imagine how the residents of Luxembourg felt. The Austrian period, lasting from 1715 to 1795, represented the golden age of Luxembourg's fortress. The Austrians looked at Vauban's already impressive fortifications and decided they could be even more impressive. Under Emperors Charles VI and Maria Theresa, Austrian military engineers embarked on the most extensive expansion and improvement program in the fortress's history. The Austrians added lunettes, which are crescent-shaped outworks that provide additional defensive positions in front of the main walls. They constructed several exterior forts with names like Fort Elysee, Fort Thungen, Fort Rumigny, and Fort Nieperg, creating a defensive perimeter that extended well beyond the original medieval city walls. They closed off valleys with locks to control water flow and prevent attackers from using the river approaches. And most impressively, they excavated nearly 25 kilometres of additional casemates into the bedrock. In 1744, General Nieperg oversaw a major expansion of the Bock casemates. The main passage, which still exists today, runs 110 metres long and reaches up to 7 metres wide in places. Branches leading off the main passage were equipped with 25 cannon emplacements, 12 facing north and 13 facing south. These weren't just holes in the wall, they were carefully designed positions that allowed artillery crews to fire on attackers while remaining almost completely protected from return fire. The expanded casemates covered an area of 1,100 square metres and could serve as barracks for up to 1,200 soldiers in the event of siege. They included not just living quarters but also stables for horses, storehouses for ammunition and food, workshops for maintaining equipment, kitchens for feeding the garrison, bakeries for producing fresh bread, and even slaughterhouses for processing meat. A well 47 metres deep provided fresh water, making the underground complex almost entirely self-sufficient. By the end of the Austrian period, the fortress of Luxembourg consisted of 3 concentric fortress walls encompassing about 180 hectares, larger than the city itself, which covered only 120 hectares. Inside this defensive envelope sat 15 major forts in the centre and another 9 on the outer perimeter. The entire complex was connected by that astonishing network of 23 kilometres of underground passages, creating what amounted to an underground city beneath the fortress. Over 40,000 square metres of tunnels, chambers and galleries had been carved into the living rock, representing centuries of engineering effort by Spanish, French and Austrian military architects. The fortress proved its worth during the French Revolutionary Wars when it resisted a French siege that lasted from November 1794 to June 1795. For 7 months, the garrison held out while French Republican forces besieged the city. When the Habsburg forces finally surrendered in 1795, the walls remained unbreached. The garrison hadn't been defeated militarily. They'd simply run out of supplies and hope of relief. This performance led French politician and engineer Lazare Carnot to declare Luxembourg the best fortress in the world, apart from Gibraltar, which confirmed what everyone already knew. Luxembourg had become the Gibraltar of the North, in fact, as well as name. After the surrender, Luxembourg was annexed to France as the Département des Forêts, the Department of Forests, which is considerably less dramatic than being called the Gibraltar of the North, but probably more accurate in terms of what the countryside looked like. The introduction of French revolutionary reforms, including conscription, triggered a peasant uprising in 1798 known as the Klepelkrieg, or Cudgel War, because apparently the peasants were so upset about being forced into military service that they grabbed whatever farming implements were handy and started a rebellion. The uprising was suppressed, and Luxembourg remained under French control through the Napoleonic period, with the regime gradually gaining acceptance among the population once the initial revolutionary fervour calmed down. During these 4 centuries of Spanish, French and Austrian rule, Luxembourg's fortress had evolved from a medieval castle on a rock into one of the most sophisticated military installations in Europe. Each successive power had looked at the existing fortifications and thought, "Good start, but we can do better," and each had added their own improvements, innovations and architectural flourishes. The Spanish built casemates, the French under Vauban perfected them, the Austrians turned them into an underground city. The fortress had become a straitjacket for the city itself. In the Middle Ages, Luxembourg had been relatively open, with 23 gates allowing easy movement between town and countryside. By the end of the 18th century, military requirements had closed most of these gates and restricted civilian construction. The fortress had to be defendable, which meant civilian needs came second to military strategy. Houses couldn't be built in certain areas because they might provide cover for attackers. Streets had to follow routes that made military sense rather than commercial convenience. The entire city existed to support and protect the fortress, rather than the fortress existing to protect the city. But this military focus had also preserved Luxembourg through centuries, when larger and wealthier territories had been conquered and absorbed by their neighbours. The fortress was too valuable to destroy and too difficult to permanently hold against determined opposition. Every power that controlled it recognised that Luxembourg was the key to controlling movement between France, Germany, and the Low Countries. This strategic value, purchased at the cost of independence, would ultimately ensure Luxembourg's survival as a distinct political entity. As the 18th century drew to a close and the Napoleonic era began, Luxembourg stood as a monument to military engineering and strategic thinking. The fortress that had started as Count Siegfried's castle in 963 had grown into a complex that took 16 years to demolish when the time finally came. But before that demolition, there would be one more major chapter in Luxembourg's story, the Congress of Vienna and the path to independence. That tale, however, awaits us in the next section. Chapter 4: French Revolution to Independence. After Luxembourg's surrender to French revolutionary forces in 1795, the territory was reorganised as the Département des Forêts, which translates to the Department of Forests. This was considerably less intimidating than Gibraltar of the North, but probably more accurate given the landscape. The revolutionary government immediately set about implementing French reforms, including the introduction of conscription, a system of mandatory military service that peasants found deeply unpopular for the obvious reason that it involved being forced into the army. In 1798, this unpopularity manifested as the Klepelkrieg, or Cudgel War, a peasant uprising named after the farming implements the rebels used as weapons. The rebellion was suppressed fairly quickly, but it demonstrated that Luxembourg's rural population wasn't particularly enthusiastic about revolutionary reforms, especially the ones that involved leaving their farms to go fight in distant wars. Under Napoleon, the French regime became more moderate and gradually gained acceptance among the population, particularly as the emperor brought stability and administrative efficiency to replace revolutionary chaos. Napoleon's empire collapsed in 1814 after decades of warfare that had exhausted France and united most of Europe against him. Luxembourg was liberated from French control, and the great powers gathered in Vienna to decide what to do with all the territories Napoleon had conquered, annexed, or reorganized. The Congress of Vienna, which ran from September 1814 to June 1815, essentially redrew the map of Europe while trying to restore monarchical legitimacy and create a balance of power that would prevent another ambitious French emperor from conquering the continent. For Luxembourg, the Congress made several consequential decisions. First, the territory would be elevated from a duchy to a Grand Duchy, which sounds impressive and was intended to restore some of the dignity lost during French occupation. Second, Luxembourg would be granted to William I of the House of Orange-Nassau, who was already king of the newly formed United Kingdom of the Netherlands. This created what's called a personal union, meaning Luxembourg and the Netherlands were separate states with the same head of state. William held the Netherlands as king and Luxembourg as Grand Duke, which gave him an impressive collection of titles if nothing else. The elevation to Grand Duchy status came with a catch, or rather several catches. Luxembourg lost a significant chunk of territory on its eastern side to Prussia, about 2,280 square kilometres, including areas around Bitburg and St. Vith. This was the second partition of Luxembourg, following the first partition in 1659 when France had taken southern territories. William received Luxembourg partly as compensation for Nassau family lands that Prussia had absorbed in Westphalia, which was the kind of territorial horse trading that characterized European diplomacy in this era. The Congress also decided that Luxembourg would become a member of the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 German states created to replace the defunct Holy Roman Empire. This membership brought its own complications. Luxembourg's fortress, still one of the most formidable in Europe despite having surrendered after that 7-month siege, would become a federal fortress of the German Confederation. This meant the fortress would be maintained with German funds and garrisoned by Prussian troops, about 6,000 of them according to treaty agreements, though in practice the garrison never reached this full strength and consisted entirely of Prussian soldiers because the Dutch never provided their promised 1/4 of the troops. On paper, Luxembourg was now independent. In reality, William I governed the Grand Duchy as though it were the 18th province of the Netherlands. Dutch fundamental law applied to Luxembourg. Luxembourg delegates sat in Dutch institutions, Dutch was taught in schools, and Luxembourg was administered from The Hague rather than Luxembourg City. The Luxembourg population didn't initially object to this arrangement, but they did object to William's economic and fiscal policies, which tended to favour Dutch commercial interests over local concerns. In 1830, the Belgian Revolution erupted when the southern provinces of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands rebelled against Dutch rule, seeking independence. Most Luxembourgers joined the Belgian insurgents, rallying to Brussels and volunteering for the Belgian army. When Belgium declared independence on October 4th, 1830, several Luxembourg representatives sat in the Constituent Assembly and later in the institutions of the young Belgian state. The entire Grand Duchy, except for Luxembourg City, had effectively become Belgian. Luxembourg City remained under Dutch and Prussian control because of that inconvenient garrison of Prussian troops stationed there. The fortress was the only part of the country that stayed loyal to William, not because the residents were particularly devoted to the Dutch king, but because thousands of armed Prussian soldiers make political dissent inadvisable. This created an awkward situation where the Grand Duchy was split between Belgian administration controlling most of the territory and Dutch-Prussian control limited to the capital city and its immediate surroundings. The great powers, alarmed by revolutionary fervour spreading across Europe, met in London to settle the Belgian question. The Treaty of the 24 Articles, signed on October 15th, 1831, proposed dividing the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg between Belgium and the Netherlands. The Belgian Parliament accepted this solution. William I refused. For 8 years Luxembourg existed under this bizarre double administration, while William stubbornly rejected the partition. Finally, in 1839, William accepted reality and signed the Treaty of London on April 19th. This agreement, often called the First Treaty of London, to distinguish it from the later treaty in 1867, established the borders that Luxembourg still has today. The western part of the Grand Duchy, including the towns of Arlon, Aubange, Bastogne, Derby, Marche-en-Famenne, Neufchâteau, and Virton, was ceded to Belgium. This territory plus the Duchy of Bouillon became Belgian Luxembourg, now the province of Luxembourg in Belgium, the largest province in that country. The partition cost Luxembourg 4,730 square kilometres, about 65% of its territory, with a population of 175,000, representing half of Luxembourg's total population. The demarcation line followed roughly the linguistic border, separating French-speaking areas that went to Belgium from German-speaking areas that remained with the Grand Duchy. The exception was the Arlon region, which, despite being German-speaking, was given to Belgium for military reasons, and French pressure to keep the Athus-Arlon road outside German Confederation influence. What remained of Luxembourg covered 2,586 square kilometres, the same size it is today. The 1839 treaty confirmed Luxembourg's independence, while maintaining the personal union with the Netherlands and membership in the German Confederation. Luxembourg had survived as a distinct political entity, though substantially smaller and still not fully independent in practice. The mid-19th century brought important economic developments. In 1842, King Grand Duke William II, who had succeeded his father in 1840, ratified Luxembourg's accession to the Zollverein, the German customs union led by Prussia. This decision connected Luxembourg's economy to German markets and would prove crucial for the development of its steel industry when iron ore deposits in the south were exploited on an industrial scale. The Austrian-Prussian War of 1866 led to the dissolution of the German Confederation, creating a power vacuum in Central Europe and uncertainty about Luxembourg's status. France, seeking territorial compensation after Prussia's expansion, attempted to purchase Luxembourg from William III, who by this point was deeply in debt. The French Emperor Napoleon III offered 5 million guilders, which William accepted on March 23, 1867. This seemed like a straightforward transaction until Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck objected. Bismarck had previously indicated to Napoleon that Prussia wouldn't oppose French influence in Luxembourg, but after Prussia's decisive victory over Austria at Königgrätz, Bismarck reversed his position. He publicised the sale to stoke German nationalist outrage, framing France as an expansionist aggressor. The situation escalated into the Luxembourg crisis, with war between France and Prussia seeming increasingly likely. The great powers rushed to prevent another European war. Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and other nations called for a conference in London to resolve the crisis peacefully. The London Conference in May 1867 resulted in the Second Treaty of London, signed on May 11, 1867. This treaty resolved the crisis through compromise, though the compromise strongly favoured Bismarck's position. The treaty reaffirmed Luxembourg's independence and declared the Grand Duchy perpetually neutral under the collective guarantee of all European great powers. Prussia would withdraw its garrison from Luxembourg City, ending centuries of foreign military occupation. And crucially, Luxembourg's fortress, the Gibraltar of the North that had been continuously fortified for over 900 years, would be demolished and never rebuilt. Dismantling the fortress took 16 years, from 1867 to 1883, at a cost of 1.5 million gold francs. Over 24 kilometres of underground casemates, along with bastions, batteries, barracks and defensive walls, were systematically destroyed. The government sold fortress land to finance demolition costs and urban development. Some fortifications were simply blown up, with local residents carting off usable materials and the rest covered with earth. The process employed many workers, and during economic downturns, additional demolition projects provided jobs for the unemployed. Not everything was destroyed. Some structures were preserved for future generations, including portions of the Bock Promontory, several towers, Fort Thungen, sections of casemates, and various bastions and walls. These remains still define Luxembourg City's appearance and became the foundation for its UNESCO World Heritage designation in 1994. But the fortress as a functioning military installation was gone, dismantled under international supervision to ensure compliance with the treaty. The demolition freed Luxembourg City from what had become a straitjacket. For centuries, military requirements had restricted where civilians could build and how the city could develop. With the fortifications gone, the city finally expanded beyond its medieval boundaries. Boulevard Royal was built in the west, adjacent to the new municipal park. The Adolphe Bridge opened up the Bourbon Plateau for development, with the Grand Avenue de la Liberté lined by elegant buildings including banks, administrative offices, and the central railway station. Luxembourg joined the Zollverein Customs Union, maintaining economic ties with Germany even as it gained political neutrality. The personal union with the Netherlands continued until 1890. When William III died that year, his daughter Wilhelmina succeeded to the Dutch throne. However, Luxembourg's succession followed the Nassau Family Pact of 1783, which specified male-only succession. Since Wilhelmina was female, she couldn't become Grand Duchess. The Grand Ducal crown passed instead to the older branch of the House of Nassau, Nassau-Weilburg, now called Luxembourg-Nassau. Duke Adolph of Nassau-Weilburg became Grand Duke Adolph of Luxembourg, founding the dynasty that still reigns today. For the first time since 1444, Luxembourg had its own exclusive ruling dynasty, separate from any larger kingdom or confederation. The period from 1795 to 1890 transformed Luxembourg from a French department to an independent and neutral Grand Duchy with its own dynasty. The fortress that had defined Luxembourg's strategic value for centuries was gone, demolished to prevent it from causing future wars. The territory had been partitioned twice, losing 3/4 of its medieval extent, but what remained was finally genuinely independent, ready to develop its own identity and economy free from the military considerations that had dominated its existence for nearly a millennium. Chapter 5. Modern Luxembourg emerges. The discovery of iron ore deposits in southern Luxembourg during the early 1840s transformed the Grand Duchy from an agricultural backwater into an industrial powerhouse. The ore, called minette, was low-grade and high in phosphorus, which initially limited its usefulness. But minette existed in abundance in the southern region that would become known as the Minette, and where there's abundant iron ore, there's eventually an iron industry, assuming you can figure out how to process it profitably. Luxembourg's membership in the Zollverein, the German customs union it joined in 1842, provided tariff-free access to German markets just as industrialization was transforming Europe. German capital flowed into Luxembourg's emerging steel industry, and German technical expertise helped establish the infrastructure needed to exploit those iron ore deposits. The construction of railways in the 1860s made it possible to transport ore, coal, and finished steel efficiently. Everything aligned perfectly for an industrial revolution. The Metz brothers, Charles, Norbert, and Auguste, were among the pioneering entrepreneurs who recognized the opportunity. In 1838, they founded a company with Belgian investment, rented a foundry, and by 1845 had built their own facility in Ike. They expanded steadily, constructing a modern steel mill in Dommeldange in the 1860s, complete with blast furnaces that could process coke and minette. Other entrepreneurs followed, establishing foundries in Esch-sur-Alzette, Rodange, Rumelange, and Dudelange. The sleepy agricultural villages of the pre-industrial era experienced population booms as workers flooded in from Germany, Italy, and later Portugal, seeking employment in the growing steel industry. The 1880s brought a technological breakthrough that would define Luxembourg's industrial future. The Thomas Gilchrist process, patented in 1879, allowed phosphorus-rich ore like minette to be converted into high-quality steel. The Metz brothers acquired the rights to this process and used it exclusively at their new foundry in Dudelange, which they founded in partnership with Victor Tesch and the Count de Berthier. This innovation meant Luxembourg's abundant but previously problematic ore deposits could compete with higher-grade ores from other regions. By the early 20th century, Luxembourg had become one of the world's major steel producers. On the eve of World War I, the Grand Duchy ranked among the 6 largest steel-producing nations globally, which is remarkable for a country smaller than Rhode Island. Steel production surged from 145,000 tons in 1900 to over 1 million tons in 1913. The industry completely dominated Luxembourg's economy, employing thousands of workers and generating wealth that transformed the nation's infrastructure and standard of living. In 1911, several major steel companies merged to create ARBED, which stood for Aciéries Réunies de Burbach-Eick-du-de-Lange, or United Steelworks of Burbach-Eick-du-de-Lange. At its founding, ARBED operated 21 blast furnaces, 3 electric furnaces, 2 steel-making plants, and several rolling mills, making it one of Europe's largest steel producers. The company's creation concentrated Luxembourg's steel industry under unified management, allowing for coordinated development and international expansion that individual companies couldn't achieve alone. Then came World War I, which tested Luxembourg's perpetual neutrality in ways the Treaty of London had never anticipated. On August 2nd, 1914, German forces entered Luxembourg as part of the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy for rapidly attacking France through the Low Countries. Despite government protests and reaffirmation of neutrality, German troops occupied all key points, including the railway network, which Germany needed for its logistics and military operations. Luxembourg's government, led by Prime Minister Paul Eyschen, faced an impossible situation. The Grand Duchy had no real military, just a volunteer company of about 120 men who couldn't possibly resist the German army. The government chose cooperation over resistance, reasoning that maintaining civil administration under occupation was better than being annexed outright. Grand Duchess Marie Adélaïde met German commanders and attempted to navigate the occupation while preserving Luxembourg's political institutions, which remained intact throughout the war even though German military authorities controlled the country. The occupation lasted from August 1914 until November 1918, when Allied forces arrived after the armistice. Those 4 years were difficult for Luxembourg. Steel production nearly halted initially because German military operations monopolized the railways. Food shortages developed as the war progressed. Allied bombing raids targeted Luxembourg's steel facilities and railway infrastructure, killing dozens of civilians. The British established espionage networks in Luxembourg that proved valuable in defeating German offensives in 1918. Politically, the occupation created serious tensions. Marie Adélaïde was perceived as too accommodating to German authorities, and her favoritism toward conservative politics before the war became controversial. Socialist and liberal parties criticized her conduct during the occupation. When the war ended, these tensions exploded. On January 9, 1919, Luxembourg's volunteer corps revolted and a committee declared Luxembourg a republic. French troops had to intervene to disperse the crowds and restore order. Marie Adélaïde abdicated on January 15, 1919, and her sister Charlotte became Grand Duchess. France and Belgium conducted secret negotiations about possibly incorporating Luxembourg into Belgium, which would have ended the Grand Duchy's independence. Luxembourg held referendums in 1919, where 80% of voters chose to maintain the monarchy and 73% voted for economic union with France, though these French territorial ambitions ultimately went nowhere. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 formally ended Luxembourg's membership in the German Zollverein as of January 1, 1919. Germany renounced rights to Luxembourg's railways and accepted termination of the Grand Duchy's neutrality regime. Luxembourg had learned that perpetual neutrality, guaranteed by treaty, meant nothing when one of the guarantors was also the invader. The Grand Duchy abandoned neutrality and joined the League of Nations in 1920, accepting collective security obligations under the League's covenant. In 1920, Luxembourg entered an economic union with Belgium called the BLEU, the Belgium-Luxembourg Economic Union, which would last for a century. This tied Luxembourg's economy to Belgium rather than Germany, reflecting the political realities of the post-war period. The union allowed free movement of goods and established a shared currency system, though Luxembourg retained its own government and sovereignty. The interwar period saw ARBED expand internationally, acquiring companies in Belgium and Germany during the 1920s. German capital was withdrawn after World War I, and Franco-Belgian Luxembourg capital took control of the steel industry. ARBED established trading companies like Colometta in 1920 to export steel worldwide, with branches in Brazil, Argentina, India, and Japan. The company even founded Companhia Siderúrgica Belgo-Mineira in Brazil in 1921, demonstrating Luxembourg Steel's global reach. Then came World War II, which made the first occupation look almost gentle by comparison. On May 10, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Luxembourg despite the Grand Duchy's declaration of neutrality. Unlike 1914, this time the government chose exile over cooperation. Grand Duchess Charlotte and the cabinet fled, eventually settling in London and later Ottawa, joining the Allied cause. Luxembourg was occupied and by 1942 had been incorporated into the Third Reich under Nazi civil administration. The Germans pursued aggressive Germanization policies, attempting to eliminate Luxembourg's national identity. They forced conscription of Luxembourgers into the German military, which triggered a general strike in 1942, the largest act of resistance during the occupation. The Nazi regime responded with brutal repression, executing strike leaders and deporting thousands. Many Luxembourgers joined Allied forces, with approximately 3,700 serving in French units alone, suffering over 2,000 combat deaths. Allied forces liberated Luxembourg in September 1944, though the Battle of the Bulge in December brought German forces back into northern Luxembourg briefly before final liberation in early 1945. The war devastated parts of the country, particularly areas affected by the Bulge offensive, but Luxembourg's steel infrastructure survived largely intact, positioning the industry for rapid post-war recovery. Post-war Luxembourg made decisive breaks with its past. The country abandoned any pretense of neutrality and became a founding member of NATO in 1949, recognizing that collective defense agreements offered better security than neutral status ever had. More importantly, Luxembourg became a founding member of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, an organization that pooled coal and steel production among 6 European nations: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The coal and steel community was explicitly designed to make war between France and Germany economically impossible by integrating their heavy industries under supranational control. For Luxembourg, this represented perfect alignment of economic interest and political security. The community's headquarters were established in Luxembourg City, giving the tiny nation outsized influence in European integration and positioning it at the centre of what would eventually become the European Union. The period from 1946 to 1975 became known as Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. Luxembourg's steel production soared from 2.45 million tonnes in 1950 to 6.45 million tonnes in 1974. The Grand Duchy achieved an exceptional annual growth rate of 6.7% between 1946 and 1951, then averaged 3.9% until 1975. The steel industry represented close to 30% of Luxembourg's total economic output during the early 1970s and employed about 16% of the national workforce. ARBD continued expanding, developing local plants while diversifying internationally. The company became a partner in Belgium's Sidmar Maritime Complex in 1962 and later obtained majority control. These decades of prosperity transformed Luxembourg's society, creating a strong middle class and establishing what became known as the Luxembourg social model, characterized by extensive worker protections and social benefits funded by steel industry wealth. But the glory years couldn't last forever. The global steel crisis of 1975 changed everything. Overcapacity in worldwide steel production, competition from Asian producers, and shifting demand patterns devastated European steel industries. Luxembourg's production, which had peaked at 6.5 million tons in 1970, began declining. The crisis forced painful restructuring, including plant closures, workforce reductions, and fundamental questions about Luxembourg's economic future. The government responded with the Tripartite Agreement of 1979, establishing a coordination committee involving employers, trade unions, and public authorities to manage the industry's decline consensually rather than through strikes and social upheaval. The state provided financial support through entities like the Société Nationale de Crédit et d'Investissement, enabling early retirements, worker retraining, and shifts toward higher value steel products. This approach prioritized social stability and became a model for managing industrial decline. More importantly, the steel crisis forced Luxembourg to diversify its economy, setting the stage for the transformation that would define modern Luxembourg. But that story of transformation from steel to finance, from industrial powerhouse to global banking centre and European capital, belongs to our final section. Chapter 6. Contemporary Luxembourg. The steel crisis of the 1970s forced Luxembourg to confront an uncomfortable truth. The industry that had defined the nation for over a century could no longer sustain its economy. While the Tripartite Agreement managed the industry's decline consensually, avoiding the social upheaval that devastated steel regions in other countries, Luxembourg's government understood that managing decline wasn't the same as securing the future. The Grand Duchy needed a new economic foundation, and remarkably, it found one that would make Luxembourg wealthier per capita than almost anywhere else on earth. The seeds of Luxembourg's transformation into a financial centre had actually been planted decades earlier. The Holding Company Act of 1929 allowed companies to establish holding structures in Luxembourg with favourable tax treatment, and the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, created in 1928, provided institutional infrastructure. But these remained relatively modest operations until the 1970s, when global economic turbulence created opportunities that Luxembourg was uniquely positioned to exploit. In the 1970s, Germany and Switzerland adopted legislation making it difficult for non-residents to deposit money in their banks. Luxembourg, meanwhile, maintained laws encouraging foreign investment and offered banking confidentiality that attracted international capital seeking stable havens during a period of oil crises, currency volatility, and shifting political alliances. American and German banks established operations in Luxembourg for syndicated loans and Eurobond market activities. The country's political stability, Central European location, multilingual workforce, and favourable regulatory environment made it an attractive alternative to traditional banking centres. The banking law of 1965 established a formal licensing regime for banks, and the creation of the Luxembourg Monetary Institute in 1968 laid foundations for modern financial supervision. But the real takeoff came in the 1980s, when Luxembourg's financial sector transformed from a promising sideline into the backbone of the economy. Banks began offering cash flow services to corporate clients and wealth management services to private individuals, pushing market specialization to new levels. The pivotal moment arrived in 1985 with the European Union's first UCITS directive, which stands for Undertakings for Collective Investment in Transferable Securities. This legislation created a regulatory framework allowing investment funds to be marketed across Europe. Luxembourg became the first EU country to adopt the directive into national law in 1988, positioning itself as the go-to jurisdiction for cross-border investment funds. The timing was perfect. Luxembourg offered a stable regulatory environment that balanced investor protection with flexibility, attracting fund managers who wanted access to European markets without excessive bureaucracy. By the end of the 1980s, Luxembourg had already become a world leader in fund management. The 1990s brought the second EU banking directive, which allowed a single banking license to be valid throughout the EU. Non-EU banks rushed to establish branches in Luxembourg to gain access to the entire European market through one regulatory gateway. The number of banks operating in Luxembourg multiplied, and the financial sector's contribution to GDP surpassed that of steel, marking a complete reversal of the economic order that had prevailed since the 1840s. The transformation was astonishing in its speed and completeness. From the mid-1980s to 2007, Luxembourg's economy grew at an average annual rate of 5.3%, while the EU15 averaged just 2.3%. These decades became known as the Splendid Twenties, following the glorious 30s of the post-war steel boom. But unlike the steel boom, which had depended on a single industry vulnerable to global competition and market shifts, Luxembourg's new prosperity rested on diversified financial services that continually evolved to meet changing market demands. Banking became the largest sector in Luxembourg's economy, accounting for approximately 25% of GDP by the early 21st century. The country specialized in cross-border fund administration, managing investment funds distributed across 70 countries. By 2012, Luxembourg ranked as the largest fund center in Europe and second in the world after the United States. Over 60% of all cross-border funds globally were based in the Grand Duchy, an extraordinary concentration of financial activity in a country of less than 700,000 people. Luxembourg attracted this activity through several competitive advantages. The multilingual, highly educated workforce could serve international clients in their own languages. The regulatory framework balanced necessary oversight with efficiency that major financial centres like London or New York couldn't always match. Political stability and membership in both the EU and the Eurozone provided institutional credibility. And Luxembourg's long tradition of discretion in banking, while later modified to meet international transparency standards, initially helped attract capital seeking privacy within a legitimate European regulatory framework. The European institutions headquartered in Luxembourg reinforced the country's international profile. The European Court of Justice, the EU's highest judicial authority, sits in Luxembourg. The European Investment Bank, the EU's financial institution, maintains its headquarters there. Various other EU agencies and offices operate from Luxembourg, making the capital city one of the 4 institutional seats of the European Union alongside Brussels, Strasbourg and Frankfurt. For a country that once derived its importance from being a fortress, Luxembourg now derived it from being a capital of European integration and finance. Meanwhile, ARBD, the steel company that had dominated Luxembourg's economy for decades, continued adapting to the new reality. The company remained significant but employed far fewer people than during its peak. In 2002, Arbed merged with Spain's Aceralia and France's Usinor to form Arcelor, creating the world's largest steel conglomerate. In 2006, Arcelor merged with Mittal Steel to form ArcelorMittal, with headquarters remaining in Luxembourg. The company maintains production facilities that still supply global markets with Luxembourg steel, but steel now represents only about 2% of Luxembourg's GDP, compared to 30% in the 1970s. Luxembourg continued diversifying beyond finance. The country developed logistics capabilities, leveraging its Central European location and excellent transportation infrastructure. Cargolux, Luxembourg's cargo airline founded in 1970, became one of Europe's leading freight carriers. The Findel airport area developed into a logistics hub. Information and communication technology emerged as a growth sector, with Luxembourg positioning itself as a leader in satellite communications and data centers. The government actively supported innovation through initiatives like the Luxembourg Cluster Initiative and the House of Startups, creating ecosystems that fostered technology development and entrepreneurship. Luxembourg also positioned itself as a leader in sustainable finance and green investment. The Luxembourg Green Exchange, launched in 2016, became the world's first platform dedicated exclusively to green, socially responsible and sustainable securities. The exchange now lists over half of all green bonds worldwide. Luxembourg enjoys a 61% market share of global assets in microfinance investment vehicles, reflecting decades of commitment to development finance. The country has established climate finance strategies and works closely with partners like China, the second largest market for green bonds, to promote environmental investment. Modern Luxembourg's population reflects its transformation into an international centre. Approximately half the residents are foreign nationals, creating an extraordinarily multicultural society. Portuguese constitute the largest foreign community, followed by French, Italian, Belgian and German populations. The workforce is even more international, with cross-border workers commuting daily from France, Belgium and Germany to work in Luxembourg's financial sector and other industries. This makes Luxembourg one of the most internationally oriented societies in the world, where 3 official languages, Luxembourgish, French and German, blend seamlessly in daily life. The country's wealth is remarkable by any measure. Luxembourg consistently ranks among the highest GDP per capita in the world according to IMF estimates. Citizens enjoy extensive social welfare systems, with social expenditure representing approximately 22% of GDP. The combination of high wages, low unemployment historically around 4 to 5%, and comprehensive social security creates living standards that few countries can match. This prosperity funds excellent infrastructure, education systems and public services that continually reinforce Luxembourg's competitive advantages. Yet prosperity brings challenges. Housing costs in Luxembourg rank among Europe's highest, creating affordability pressures even for well-paid professionals. The small domestic market means Luxembourg depends entirely on international success, making the economy vulnerable to global financial regulatory changes and competition from other financial centres. The global financial crisis of 2008 tested Luxembourg's resilience, though the robust regulatory framework and prudent banking practices helped the financial sector weather the storm better than many competitors. Economic growth stalled between 2008 and 2011, but Luxembourg recovered and continued expanding, demonstrating the strength of its diversified service economy. Luxembourg faces ongoing pressure regarding its tax policies and banking practices. In 2009, the G20 added Luxembourg to a grey list of nations with questionable banking arrangements, though Luxembourg was removed from the list later that year after agreeing to modify practices. The classic tax-exempt holding company established in 1929 was outlawed on December 31st, 2010, as the European Commission deemed it illegal state aid. Luxembourg has gradually adapted to international demands for transparency and tax cooperation, balancing the need to maintain competitiveness with requirements to meet evolving global standards. The physical landscape of Luxembourg reflects this blend of history and modernity. The old quarters of Luxembourg City, including the Bock casemates and remaining fortress walls, were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994, recognizing their historical significance. Tourists can explore 17 kilometers of underground tunnels, walking through passages carved by Spanish, French, and Austrian engineers centuries ago. The fortress that was demolished to prevent wars now attracts visitors who marvel at its engineering and strategic importance. But modern Luxembourg City also features gleaming office towers housing international banks, European institutions in contemporary buildings, and a skyline that would have astonished Count Siegfried. The Kirchberg Plateau hosts the European Court of Justice and other EU institutions in modernist architecture. The financial district buzzes with activity and languages from around the world. The contrast between medieval ramparts and modern financial infrastructure captures Luxembourg's journey from fortress to finance in physical form. In the Minette region, former steel sites have been transformed into cultural centres and innovation hubs. The Belleville blast furnaces, once symbols of industrial might, now stand as monuments to Luxembourg's industrial heritage, while surrounding areas house the University of Luxembourg and technology companies. This repurposing of industrial heritage reflects Luxembourg's approach to managing transitions, preserving history while embracing change, rather than erasing the past to build the future. Luxembourg's story from 963 to the present is ultimately about survival through adaptation. Count Siegfried traded for a castle on a rock because the location offered defensive advantages at a time when defense determined survival. That castle evolved into a fortress that guaranteed Luxembourg's strategic value even when the territory lacked the population or resources to defend itself militarily. When the fortress was demolished in the 1870s, Luxembourg found new value in steel production during the Industrial Age. When steel declined, Luxembourg reinvented itself again as a financial centre and European capital. At each transition, Luxembourg's small size, which could have been a fatal weakness, proved an unexpected advantage. Small enough to change direction decisively, small enough that consensus could be built through tripartite negotiations, small enough to specialise rather than trying to compete across all sectors. Luxembourg turned limitations into competitive strengths. The same geographic position that made it valuable as a fortress made it valuable as a crossroads for European finance and institutions. Today's Luxembourg, wealthy and influential far beyond what its size would suggest, stands as a monument to strategic adaptation and European integration. The Grand Duchy that started as Siegfried's castle survived centuries of foreign occupation, endured 2 world wars, and transformed its economy twice in 50 years, now helps govern Europe's economy and adjudicate its laws. From that rocky promontory above the Alzette River, Luxembourg built something far more impressive than any fortress, a nation that thrives not by conquering others but by connecting them, not through military power, but through economic integration, and not by resisting change, but by embracing it before change becomes crisis. And with that, we've traced Luxembourg's journey from Celtic oppidum to contemporary European capital, from steel powerhouse to financial centre, from conquered territory to sovereign nation. A small country with an outsized history, proof that survival and prosperity sometimes depend less on size than on timing, adaptation, and the wisdom to recognize when the old certainties no longer serve the future. Sweet dreams, and may you remember at least some of what you learned about the Gibraltar of the North that became the financial capital of Europe,